I'm curious about a lot of things, in particular, the kinds of sounds that we use in medical devices, because they're often designed in a way that works really well for machines, but actually doesn't work real well for humans. My name is Michael Schutz, and I'm professor of music, cognition, and percussion at McMaster University.
Yes, I'd really like to hear more about that aspect of your research.
Well, in general, if you've ever been in a hospital, you've probably heard some of those terrible beeps that come from machines all around patients. And being in hospital is never very pleasant, and it just sort of seems like one of those things you have to deal with. But it turns out a lot of those beeps don't have to be so bad in order to be effective. And in fact, they're actually be more helpful to medical staff if they were less annoying for the patients and for the staff themselves. And so that's one of the things that we research in my team is how we can draw on some ideas about how musicians communicate to try and improve these auditory alerting systems in hospitals.
So let's say usually almost every time when I go in and they have those automated machines to take your pulse and your temperature, because I have a very low pulse, so it starts going beep, 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 and people are looking at me like, what, are you a marathon runner? And I'm like, no, okay, this is normal. And every time, but it does sound kind of urgent, right? It sounds like the machine is alerting someone that there's something wrong with this person. So is that what you're talking about, that those noises or those signals kind of don't need to be so jarring in a way, or tell me more?
Yeah, so one of the problems is we call them auditory alarms. And I use that term a lot because that's what researchers in my area use. But that name then implies they should be, well, alarming. And so each beep is often designed to be attention grabbing and sound somewhat urgent. And it makes sense if you think that each beep means something needs an immediate action. But if it's just monitoring like your blood pressure and saying it's moving slightly out of range, maybe it's in a way that's not even a problem for you, then making each and every sound on all these devices sort of maximally annoying is not really very helpful because it doesn't help doctors cut through to the kinds of signals that they need. And the problem is each patient will generate up to hundreds of alarms per day in a hospital, and most of them don't require an urgent response. So rather than an alarm, I think it's better to think about these as an auditory interface or a way of communicating with sound. The same way we get information from our phones without every update causing the phone to seize and flash and make a lot of sounds, like sometimes the updates can be more subtle. And so the problem with a lot of the medical devices is that they've just tended to focus on the maximum attention grabbing thing for each individual alert, even though some of them don't need immediate responses.
An ideal hospital in your, imagination, what would that sound like?
It's a great question. And so often people ask, like, do you want the hospital to sound like a symphony orchestra? And so the goal is not to have an aesthetically pleasing experience when you go to the hospital. If you're anything like me, when you're in the hospital, all you want to do is get out. And so what we want is these to be maximally communicative, not necessarily just sounding as pleasant as possible. So I think what we can do with music is not try to mimic like a musical composition, but rather look at how individual sounds are used in a piece in order to convey information. So you can look at how composers would write sounds for different instruments that they want to keep separated and use that as a way to think about how we can keep alerts from stepping on each other's toes in an operating room. And similarly, you can look at how composers might construct a piece with thousands of notes, making sure that each individual note doesn't become very annoying while it's still detectable. And so one thing we've been looking at a lot recently are percussive sounds. And partly because as a percussionist, I spent a lot of time with percussive sounds, but also because I think there's actually something special about them. We've done some research showing that there are particular properties that could be really helpful. And so one thing we've done is take the sound of a musical triangle, that instrument that you've probably heard in the back of the orchestra, maybe not thought about that much, and use it as a model for a sound that can cut through a lot of noise without being really annoying. And so we look at specifically acoustically how instrument makers build that. I think we have a really good candidate, cookbook for what we can do with sound to make it cut through without being annoying.
Do healthcare staff and professionals, do they get numb to these noises?
They hate the alarms. I mean, every doctor and every nurse that I've talked to says the alarms are terrible. And a common sort of point is like when I first started working in a hospital, I thought they were awful. And then I just sort of pushed it to the side because it's one of many things that are unpleasant about the hospital. Those gowns that they put on patients aren't particularly pleasing aesthetically, nor are they particularly comfortable, but there's a medical reason why we need to wear them. And similarly, hospitals are often very reverberant because we need the floors to be easy to clean, at a non-porous surface. So there's many aspects of being in a hospital that aren't very pleasant. The real tragedy and also the opportunity with the alarms is that the sound doesn't have to be this bad. These are sounds that are, believe it or not, designed. They just seem to be designed in a way that doesn't work very well for humans. And so I think there's a lot of potential for looking at other areas of design sound, like in music, for insights on how we can improve that.
How could they go in and re-engineer all their sounds? What would that look like?
So the easy answer is just either replace the sounds of machines or as you buy new machines, get machines with better sounds. The hard question is how do you get machine device manufacturers to create better sounds? And so here it's really a collective action problem because device manufacturers build sounds in these situations that conform to certain standards. And that way, when they go to sell their products, they can say it follows a certain standard. Now, we want our devices in hospitals to be standardized because you don't want doctors who move to a different hospital to now not know what the alarms mean because they've chosen a totally different sound set. So the standardization isn't in principle a bad thing. It's just unfortunate that the standards have settled on what I think of as the worst possible sound option, this tone beat. And so there's a whole history as to how we ended up with that. But the challenge here is it's not like I can just show you a better sound and suddenly human health can be improved because that sound's not going to help anyone until a device manufacturer puts it in their device. And they're not going to put it in their device until the standards committees open up to different kinds of sounds. And the challenge with the standards committees is that when you go to them with ideas, they understandably want evidence that this will work in the real world. And so this is not the kind of thing that one researcher or even like a half dozen researchers are going to solve. We really need a buy-in from politicians, from healthcare staff, from the public, and from patients to try and figure out not only what sounds work better, but then also work to get them into those devices. And so I really see my role in all this as the audio geek person. Like I can tweak up the sounds in many different ways. We can run a lot of experiments to test like which sound cuts through better, which sound is less annoying, and then bring sort of a cookbook of ideas to the next stage of sound designers and manufacturers because what we need is first and foremost, I think, the academic research to show the better path and then engaging with all the different stakeholders to then get that better path actually into the devices in our hospitals. Now, the irony is that the current sounds and a lot of devices in hospitals were never tested or validated before they were put into machines. They were just baked into the standards in the early days before we had really standardized sounds. And now changing them requires all this evidence, which is sort of what we should have done in the first place. But all we can deal with is the situation that we're in now. And so I talk to politicians, do podcasts, try to do outreach to the community because it's only going to get better if we have discussion about this at many different levels.
Do the sounds negatively impact the health of healthcare workers?
So, in addition to being problematic for patient care, they can create something called alarm fatigue, where doctors and nurses go home and hear the horrible ringing in their heads for hours after their shift ends. Because remember, if you're working a long shift in the hospital or doing an intensive surgery, you can be exposed to these continually for, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 or more hours. So I work with an anesthesiologist who's routinely in the operating room for these long stretches of time. And it's actually how I got involved and made contact with the medical community because in talking with him and realizing how problematic this is from a healthcare perspective, I realized there's not just harm to patients, there's also harm to the medical staff who are taking care of the patients.
Is there any other evidence or research about other impacts or negative influences in health of people overall from repetitive sound?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a wide body of research showing major problems with the sounds. Everything from the way they cover up other sounds, the technical term is called masking, where one alarm covers the other one, to being hard to remember what the alarm's supposed to mean, to some of the more problematic things like this alarm fatigue that is a problem for both the staff and for patients. I think the worst and most problematic aspect of the alarms is that there's actually situations where the sound design is so bad, it creates so many problems, it's actually contributed to patient deaths. And so there was an FDA survey showing that over a 4-year window, there was something like 500 deaths attributable to problematic alarm design. Now, I think that's obviously the worst case outcome of some of these. There's also many less extreme problems with everything from the alarm fatigue to alarms missed at critical moments. I talked to one retired nurse who described her hospital as a beeping hellscape, as all these different patients are generating all these sounds. And I think to me, as a musician, it's so tragic. And it would be funny if it weren't actually happening in hospitals all over the world because you think about in music, we'll happily listen to thousands and tens of thousands of notes throughout a piece. And rarely do we come away thinking, that was a very annoying, set of notes. And so while we're not trying to create a symphony in the operating room, I think we can learn a lot from looking at the kinds of sounds people choose to listen to for many hours at a time and take those insights and use them in these devices.
You mentioned before that I guess there are certain sounds that are like a standard. So you go at every single hospital and they're the standard sound for a particular topic or issue that's occurring. How many different sounds exist in a hospital?
So I've got a file somewhere a colleague sent where they were able to go into an operating room and they turned on all the machines so you could hear all the sounds. And while they're all slightly different, it just sounded to me like those 80s Atari's video games with these like terrible, I mean, interesting, but just not very diverse sounds. And so if you think about from the perspective of music, basically they're all occupying this very small percentage of what we can do with sound. Now, the interesting thing is you go to sound designers that work on video games or in film or in television, and they would just laugh at the idea of confining their sound palette to this particular type of sound. But when you're dealing with sounds governed by standards committees, they don't have the same degrees of freedom that a sound designer would, but they're also not approaching the sound design in the same way. It's treated very much like an engineering problem. Like we will specify the way the sound should start, specify the way it should end, the other things in there, and from an engineering perspective, they come up with a great solution. So if the goal of the machines were to talk to other machines, I think they have a winning recipe. But when the goal is to interface with humans, you're ignoring centuries of musical insight about how humans process sound. And also, a century of psychophysical research about what's important for the human brain. And so that's where I think there's so much potential for improvement.
What about overall, like in general, sounds like in our life? I mean, our iPhones now are making sounds constantly. We're using alarms to remember things. It seems like there are a lot of those type of sounds that might be similar, and people have still those very, I don't know, like you say, like video game or last generation sounds on their phones. How does that come into play in terms of our health and our psychology, our environment, our well-being overall?
So it can have a really big and meaningful impact on our mood and overall emotional state. What's interesting about phone design is if you think about the massive difference in the soundscape of phones between now and 10 years ago, or even better, 20 years ago, where 20 years ago they were more of the simple beeps. But with phones, we have a consumer facing product where if your competitors come out with a better sounding phone, you're going to be left in the dust unless you adopt. And so you look what phones do these days, and it's actually very sophisticated from a sound design perspective. And in fact, what I find really almost hilarious is for many years, Apple used a lot of percussive sounds for their ringtones. There was one called the marimba, which everyone would recognize, and you can add in there. The funny thing for me as a percussionist is I play a lot of marimba. I've got one behind me here. No one in the civilian world seems to know what that is, and I'm always explaining what that is, like where it comes from, like why would you play this like weird obscure thing, and yet a large percentage of the Western world is walking around with those sounds going off in their pocket all the time, and so I think there's something particularly pleasing about that sound, and Apple didn't settle on that by accident. They whether they did controlled experiments in a lab or just tried listening experiments or used intuition, they sort of figured out what works in terms of communication with sound. And I heard this fantastic podcast. I'm a 20,000 hertz nut. I do a great job with podcasts about sounds. And when they talk with their sound designers, they go through and it's almost like a percussion ensemble concert. They're like, and this one's based on this kind of percussion instrument. This one's based on that, tweaked in this certain way. And so there's something about impact sounds that I think we're quite attuned to. And if you step back, even think about them outside of music, impact sounds are things that we hear all the time. Anytime a footsteps, door slams, you set something down on the counter, we're dealing with impact sounds. And so we hear them from a very young age. And I think they played a very big role in the evolution of our auditory system. I mean, you can go back tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of years. I don't know exactly what our soundscape was then, but I'm pretty sure we had a lot of those impact sounds because they happen anytime two materials collide. And so the auditory system evolved in a way where it's very good at extracting information from these kinds of sounds, even though in a sense they're very complex. And so I think one of the fallacies in the design of these auditory alert systems and medical devices is that they're designed to be simple. So like each tone will use the same simple structure, they'll use the same rhythm and the same timbre. And from a visual design perspective, I can see how that benefit might be there. But from if you look at the way humans communicate with sound in the real world, that's not at all the kinds of sounds that we choose to use. And so that's why I think it's sort of comedic slash tragic that we've just ignored centuries of progress in the development of musical instruments and the development of musical compositions and just tried to sort of create our own soundscape based on engineering principles.
What's the path to get these sounds into a device?
It seems like it'd be pretty simple. Like you build a better sound and the world should beat a path to your door. But the problem is it's a very complex chain between making a discovery about a better sound and then actually getting that sound into practical use. And so years ago, I read a fantastic New York Times article that I think summarizes this problem well in a very different context. And there it was about pasteurization. And it starts off asking, what's your understanding of how pasteurization helped human health? And like many people, I thought, well, someone discovered this in a lab and then people had much better lives as a result. But the time between when Pasteur made that discovery and when pasteurization of milk became, I think, commonplace by law in the US was 50 years, 50. And because he made this discovery and found a better way to make milk, but manufacturers were concerned about embracing that process because they were worried that people might not like the taste of it and it might harm sales. And then like politicians were concerned about regulating this because well they were asking the industry what they were saying and it wasn't clear if there was evidence that this would work in real world context, not just in the laboratory. And so there was a whole fascinating series of events which actually got this more on the public's view and eventually led to the adoption of rules and laws around the pasteurization of milk, but it took 5 decades. And so, while I hope it doesn't take 50 years to improve the sounds in the medical devices, I think it's a very instructive example because the actual scientific discovery was the beginning of the process of helping people and not the end. And so that's why I think it's so important to engage with the public and do this work like you're doing on the podcast to raise awareness. And I'll talk with politicians and designers and all sorts of other folks because it's not the kind of problem that's going to be solved just by coming up with a better sound. And so I think it's important to be clear-eyed about what I can actually do here. And I feel like my lane in all this is playing around with the sounds, figuring out here are a number of ways in which you can dial the annoyance up or dial it down. Here's a number of ways in which you can have multiple systems sounding at once without them overlapping or masking each other, and then offer these as potential solutions. But then it's going to take discussions amongst the industry and the regulatory committee and patient advocacy groups to actually bring those things into action. And so it's really a team effort here. And so I think that's important to keep in mind because one question that often comes up is like, well, if you've figured out all these things, like why are the devices still making these terrible sounds? And one of my colleagues, I think, paraphrased the challenge of improving the alarms is like changing the course of a ship by using like a teaspoon in the ocean to sort of move the water along. And so there's a lot of inertia sort of down the path that we're on now. And it's not because anyone's being inattentive to science or because people are being greedy and like that flat tone industry is really making a killing, off of all this. It's just that it's a very complicated problem with a lot of different angles. And so I think that's crucial to keep in mind. Like if we want to have progress on this issue, it's going to take pressure and awareness from a really broad range of people. And my personal hope is that we can fix these sounds in hospitals before I have to spend much time in the hospital myself.
What could be a step that someone would take in order to at least try to make some effort for change? What could they do?
So there's a couple of things. One, actually, if there's patients out there with stories, I'd be very interested in chatting with you. I've had some very moving conversations with people. One was actually after a talk in Ohio, a woman came up and said she'd spent a year in the hospital for something medically horrible. But the worst part for her was being surrounded by all these beeping machines all the time, where the beeps didn't really mean much. And so just hearing her talk about this experience, the room went silent. I spent an hour talking about here's all the science behind all this, and here's what's really interesting. And just her story about this experience was so powerful. So I think that is probably more effective than me talking about sounds and all these technical things on a podcast. So I'd be very interested to hear from patients. I think also just sharing your story on podcasts. I know I gave a TEDx talk about this a couple years ago, and like that's reached many more people than probably my articles ever will. So I think these kinds of public outreach things are very powerful and also very important. So those are all things that people can do if you've been personally affected by this, either as a patient or as a medical staff.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you for adding that in. That's really important. Thank you for speaking with me. I really appreciate your time today.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.